An unstoppable force is coming. Will humanity rise, or will we fall like all the others before us? Imagine this, an unstoppable force is heading straight for Earth, and we have only days to prepare. The first time humanity faces an existential threat, it's not from a rival nation, but from something beyond the stars, something far worse. Can we survive, or will we be wiped out just like every other civilization that tried to resist? Stay with me till the end because you won't believe what happens next. Do you think humanity will survive, or will we be another tragic footnote in the universe's endless cycle of destruction? Welcome to HFY Sci-Fi Love and War Story, where we dive deep into the most epic, heart-pounding sci-fi tales from across the galaxy. If you love intense stories, unexpected twists, and questions about humanity's fate, hit that like button, drop a comment below, and subscribe to stay updated on all the action. But wait! I have a challenge for you. If you think you know the secret to surviving alien encounters, leave the word survive in your comment. Let's see who's paying attention. In the dimly lit control room of the United Nations Space Command headquarters, Commander William Carter felt the weight of history pressing down on his shoulders. The alarm's blare had sent everyone into a frenzy, but for Carter, it was just another day in a life defined by the impossible. As he hastily adjusted his uniform, his mind raced. A fleet of unknown ships, faster than anything humanity had ever tracked, was hurtling toward the solar system, and all of it was about to land squarely on his shoulders. The countdown to first contact was ticking, and no one, not even the aliens themselves, had any idea what it would mean for Earth. Carter, we've got 6 days, Lieutenant Olivia Grant's voice broke through the haze of his thoughts. They'll reach Pluto's orbit in 6 days. Should we prepare a defensive response? Defensive? Carter muttered, his eyes glued to the large screen showing the alien ships in deep space. First, we try to talk. Then, we see if we need to shoot. The cold uncertainty hung thick in the air, heavier than the pressure of the moment itself. What had once been a world at war with itself, mired in petty human conflicts, was now about to become the stage for a battle far beyond their comprehension. As the USS Horizon prepared for launch, Carter couldn't help but wonder, were they ready for what was coming? The truth was, none of them were. Humanity, with all its ambition, had barely scratched the surface of the stars, and now it was facing something ancient, something deeply frightening. Upon arrival, the crew was greeted by an alien, an entity known as HFY War, from the Valori species. It looked nothing like anything humanity had ever imagined. A shimmering blue figure, with large, unnervingly black eyes and an almost aquatic presence. It was almost comical how human-like the Valori were in some respects, yet profoundly alien in others. HFY War was a diplomat, but even his voice, smooth, lilting, and soothing, carried a warning that would set the stage for humanity's reckoning. We are running, HFY War explained. We are running from the Devourers. They destroy everything, planets, species, civilizations, every 10,000 years. Now they are coming for you. Humanity had no context for such a threat. The idea that an unstoppable force, a swarm of machines, had been tearing through galaxies like a cosmic wildfire, destroying everything in its path, was too much. Even the Valori, advanced and resourceful, had become refugees, fleeing for their lives. As HFY War spoke, Carter couldn't help but feel an overwhelming sense of disgust, not at the alien, but at the thought of running from such a force. It was a feeling he was all too familiar with. People ran all the time, ran from responsibility, ran from conflict, ran from what scared them. But now, here was the ultimate test. Was humanity going to do the same? Captain Maria Sanchez, ever the skeptic, pulled Carter aside after the meeting. She wasn't buying the Refugee Act. I don't trust them, she said. They're taking resources from every system they've passed. We're not dealing with refugees. They're conquerors in their own way. Her words hit harder than Carter had expected. They weren't just running. They were feeding off the resources of every system, stripping entire planets bare. It was a cold reminder of humanity's own selfishness, the way people consumed the world without thinking about the long-term consequences. The Valori had proven that survival could come at the expense of the very things that made a system worth saving. Send a message to the UN, Carter said, his voice tightening with resolve. It's not just the devourers we have to worry about. It's the way we fight them. What followed was chaos. More alien species arrived, each with their own twisted tale of flight and loss. The Krell, reptilian and brutal, the Luminari, creatures of light and harmonies. All of them fleeing, all of them too scared to face the devourers head-on. And humanity? Humanity wasn't ready either, but they had one thing none of the others did, the will to stand and fight. The months leading up to the devourers' arrival were a blur of preparations. Every factory on Earth retooled for war. Schools became training grounds, farms expanded, weapons manufactured, ships constructed. The human race was preparing to do the one thing no one in the galaxy had ever dared to do, fight back. General Lisa Chen stood firm in the face of overwhelming opposition. "We have resources, and we have a solar system full of opportunities," she said, her voice ringing out in the command room. "The asteroid belt is our first line of defense. Let's turn it into a weapon." There was no grand strategy, no foolproof plan. It was just human grit. And human stubbornness. Earth was going to stand and fight, and if they were going to die, they were going to do it on their feet. But as the countdown continued, Carter couldn't shake the feeling that the cost of this decision would be far greater than anyone was prepared for. They weren't just fighting for Earth anymore, they were fighting for everything humanity had ever believed in. And in a universe this vast, maybe that wasn't enough. The day the Devourers arrived, the human fleet gathered in orbit, ready to fight. The asteroid minefield had slowed the enemy, but it was just the beginning. It was chaos, complete and utter chaos. As the ships maneuvered and blasted, Carter could only think of the cost, the millions of lives that would be lost in this struggle. Then, the final twist. As the enemy adapted and regrouped, something shifted. The alien fleets, those same refugees, chose to fight alongside humanity. They had seen what Carter had seen, felt the fire of defiance in their bones. For once, the galaxy wasn't just running. As the battle reached its peak, Carter and his team had one final chance to end it all. They boarded a Valori ship and made their way into the heart of the Devourer fleet, with nothing more than hope and a very questionable plan. In the end, it wasn't the technology that saved them, it was the audacity to try. In the aftermath, as Carter looked out across the shattered remains of the battlefield, he couldn't help but laugh. "Well, at least we won," he muttered, rubbing his face. "Not sure what we won, but hey, we didn't get vaporized." And that, Carter thought with a smirk, was what made humanity so damn stubborn. The tension in the control room was unbearable. Carter stood with his back straight, the glow of the screens casting sharp shadows across his face. The alien ships were closing in faster than anything the human fleet had ever encountered. The fact that these ships were coming at all was disturbing enough, but the speed, the sheer audacity of it, made it feel like the universe was playing a sick joke. Carter's mind kept flashing to the words of ZTH Noir, the Valori ambassador, as he detailed the looming threat of the Devourers, machines that wiped out civilizations every 10,000 years, like clockwork. "We've only got 6 days, Lieutenant Olivia Grant muttered from the console. The cold precision of her voice was a stark contrast to the knot tightening in Carter's gut. 6 days. The kind of timeline that, in any other situation, would feel like a luxury. But here, it was just a countdown to extinction. "We're not ready," Captain Maria Sanchez said, standing beside him, her face tense with a mixture of doubt and resolve. "None of us are. I mean, do we even know what we're dealing with? These Devourers are machines. Machines that have already killed, what, 17 species?" Carter's jaw clenched, the weight of Sanchez's words sinking in like a lead ball. He had fought in the past, had seen death up close, his unit had lost too many friends in pointless wars on Earth. But this was different. A death sentence from the cosmos. It wasn't just a war for territory or resources, this was a war for survival against an unstoppable enemy. "Prepare for launch," Carter ordered, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "We make first contact. And we do it on our terms." The USS Horizon was humanity's best hope, fast, powerful, and equipped with the latest technology. But no matter how advanced, it still felt like a toy in the face of an ancient, ruthless predator. Carter stood at the helm, watching the ship leave Earth behind. He'd always been able to rely on logic, on military training, on tactics. But this was something beyond comprehension. Something that made every war he'd ever fought feel small in comparison. As they neared the alien fleet, the moment of truth arrived. The first contact. It wasn't supposed to feel this personal. But the alien ambassador, HFY War, appeared on the screen, his shimmering blue form a stark contrast to the steel gray of the horizon. His voice, strangely melodic, filled the room. "We are the Valori," HFY War said, the words echoing through the quiet control room. "We come seeking safe passage through your system." Safe passage? Carter's mind raced. The truth felt like a lie wrapped in politeness. These Valori weren't just looking for safe passage, they were running. Running from something so monstrous that the mere mention of it sent shivers down Carter's spine. They flee from the Devourers, HFY War continued. They are a race of machines that consume everything, planets, civilizations, resources. We have survived only by running. You, humans, are next. A sick realization washed over Carter. He wasn't just talking to an alien, he was talking to a species whose entire existence had been defined by fear. And now they were asking for help, for a place to hide. Was this the future of humanity? To be reduced to fleeing at the first sign of danger? Or would they stand and fight? Carter didn't hesitate. "We're not running," he said, his voice firm, the weight of leadership settling onto his shoulders. "We'll fight." And fight they would. The horizon returned to Earth, bringing with it the grim reality of the Devourer's advance. As Carter stood before the United Nations in a special session, he could feel the weight of every decision, every life, every moment. "You understand what we face," HFY War said quietly, his voice tinged with disbelief. "You understand that we are choosing extinction?" Carter didn't flinch. "We're choosing to fight," he replied, his voice unwavering. "And if we die standing." The next days were chaos, a frantic race to prepare. Factories switched to wartime production, resources were diverted, and the people of Earth were divided. Some, like General Paul Bennett, advocated for evacuation, flee before the Devourers could strike. Others, like Carter and General Lisa Chin, refused to accept that running was an option. There was a brief but heated debate between them, a sharp contrast of ideology. The evacuators argued they couldn't fight a machine army, that they had no chance. The fighters, led by Carter, argued that survival without fighting wasn't survival at all. It was just delay. And so, the preparations continued, a frenzy of construction and strategy. They set up asteroid defenses, laid traps, and armed themselves to the teeth. The war had begun, and humanity was finally doing what it did best, fighting back. Then, the first wave of the Devourers hit. A series of black, insectoid ships appeared in the distance, their hulking forms sending ripples of fear through the human fleet. They struck first at the outer colonies, wiping out outposts like they were nothing more than specks of dust. The horizon was too far to assist. But the attack was a blessing in disguise. It showed humanity the enemy's strategy. They were a machine swarm, precise, unfeeling. "They're adapting," Carter muttered as he watched the Devourer's ships shift their formation, dodging human fire with unsettling speed. "It's like they've seen this before." "Maybe they have," Sanchez replied, her eyes narrowing as she observed the battlefield. "Maybe this is how they do it. They hit, they destroy, and they move on." The first confrontation was chaotic. Humanity was not prepared for the level of destruction the Devourers brought, and yet, there was something in their resilience, something in the raw defiance they showed in the face of insurmountable odds. For once, Carter realized humanity had a chance. Not because they were the strongest, not because they were the most prepared, but because they were the only species in the galaxy that refused to run. And in that moment, something clicked inside Carter's mind. He knew what he had to do. The Devourers had never faced this kind of resistance. They'd never faced humanity. In the midst of the chaos, the decision was made. The final plan would not just involve military might, it would involve the very thing that set humanity apart, the will to survive at any cost. And just before the battle reached its peak, as Carter stood on the command deck, watching the enemy advance, he turned to Sanchez with a wry smile. "Well, at least we'll go down fighting. No running. Unless, of course, we end up winning." Sanchez raised an eyebrow. "Or we'll just make the Devourers regret ever showing up to the party." "Yeah, well," Carter muttered with a grin, "if nothing else, we'll give them one hell of a bad review on Yelp." The tension aboard the Horizon was suffocating. Commander Carter stared out the observation window, his eyes fixed on the swirling, vibrant blue of the distant stars. It was beautiful, almost too beautiful, given what they were about to face. It had only been a few days since they received their first transmission from the Valori, and the weight of the galaxy had already descended on Earth's shoulders. Yet, as he stood there, he couldn't shake the nagging thought that everything felt wrong. "You don't look like a man who's about to meet an alien species," Sanchez remarked, appearing beside him. Her voice had a casual edge, but Carter knew her well enough to sense the unease beneath it. After all, she had lost too many comrades in wars that shouldn't have been fought. She understood loss better than anyone. "I don't know what's worse," Carter said, his voice low, almost too reflective for the moment. "The fact that we're standing on the precipice of meeting our first alien race, or the fact that we're all just a bunch of naive idiots who are about to make the same damn mistakes all over again." Sanchez raised an eyebrow, a small smirk tugging at the corner of her mouth. "You've been reading too much philosophy again, Carter." "Maybe," he replied, his gaze never wavering from the stars. "But you can't deny that we're repeating history. The whole galaxy is running from something, and here we are, deciding to be the ones who don't." Sanchez let out a quiet laugh. "Yeah, well, you know the saying, if you're going to go out swinging." Carter turned to her, a slight chuckle escaping his lips. "Let's hope we can swing hard enough to not get annihilated." The following days blurred together. Carter and his crew worked tirelessly to prepare for the arrival of the alien fleet. Despite the cold professionalism that accompanied their preparations, every crew member knew that what they were doing was no longer just about technology or tactics. This was about survival, about the very essence of humanity, fighting against something they didn't understand and might never be able to. For all their advancements, humans were still just an infant species in the vast, uncaring universe. Yet here they were, gearing up to take a stand. As the alien ships finally arrived, Carter and his crew held their breath. The ships were unlike anything they had ever seen, sleek, insect-like, and darker than the night sky. The Valori were the first to make contact, their ambassador, HFY War, communicating in perfect English. His voice was oddly soothing, a strange juxtaposition to the message he carried. Earth was now in the crosshairs of the Devourers, an ancient, malevolent machine race that had already destroyed countless civilizations. "They're not refugees," Carter, Sanchez had said as they reviewed the data provided by the Valori. "They're survivors. And they're not here to save us. They're here to use us." It didn't sit well with Carter. For decades, humanity had been looking outward, hoping for a moment like this, when they would meet another civilization. But what if that moment wasn't about making new friends, but about survival at the expense of another species? "The Devourers are coming, Commander. If you don't help us, you'll be destroyed along with the rest of the galaxy." HFY War's words echoed in Carter's mind, the cold reality of their situation sinking deeper into his bones. But as the Valori's warnings painted the picture of impending doom, something in Carter snapped. He couldn't let this go on. It was the same damn story, always running, always giving up. Humanity had been doing that for centuries. They had the chance to fight. They had to. "We're not running," Carter declared, his voice firm, breaking the silence in the room. "We stand our ground. We make our stand here." The decision wasn't easy. It never was. But as the weeks passed, the preparations for war moved ahead at a rapid pace. Carter's mind churned with thoughts of the cost. It would be a fight unlike any humanity had ever seen. And he knew, deep down, that the losses would be immense. But the alternative was too terrible to consider, to give up, to run, to become just another species that had fallen prey to an ancient, uncaring enemy. As Earth's defenses were slowly constructed, Carter found himself constantly haunted by memories of past wars, wars fought for oil, for power, for land. Wars that never seemed to end. The ghosts of those conflicts had never truly left him. Every time he stepped into a new battle, he carried those memories, those faces, those names. They never faded. And this war was no different. In one of the many strategy meetings, General Chen had laid out the final defense plan. "The asteroid belt is our first line of defense," she said, eyes sharp and focused. "It's our only advantage. We'll create a moving minefield, use it to slow them down. It's not perfect, but it gives us a fighting chance." Carter had studied the map. It looked like madness. But madness had always been the only way forward when it came to humanity's survival. He felt a deep, dark satisfaction at the thought. If they were going to die, they might as well go down swinging. The first wave of devourers came without warning. They arrived like a storm, overwhelming the solar system's defenses. Ships exploded in the vacuum of space, as humanity's last-ditch efforts to stop them seemed like little more than a nuisance. Carter watched in grim silence, his heart racing, as they lost the first battle. But there was no retreat, no second thoughts. They were committed. And then, the second phase of the plan kicked in. The asteroid field, humanity's only real defensive advantage, was activated. The large rocks, now fitted with engines and turning into an unpredictable minefield, moved with terrifying precision. For a moment, it worked. The devourers were forced to slow down, their perfect formation unraveling. It was the first time the machines had been thrown off course. But Carter knew it wouldn't last. "They'll adapt," Sanchez muttered, watching the chaos unfold on the monitor. "They always do." And as the devourers regrouped, adapting quickly to the new threat, Carter couldn't help but smile, bitterly amused by the irony of it all. It wasn't the technology, the ships, or the weapons that would win this fight. It was the fact that humanity had never been afraid to stand its ground. They had survived every war, every crisis, simply because they never gave up, never ran. But standing firm didn't mean winning. With a chuckle, Carter muttered, "Well, at least we've got one thing right. If we're going to die, we're doing it with style." He looked at Sanchez, who met his gaze with a wry grin. "Yeah, but at least we're not going down as a bunch of refugees." Commander Carter's hands trembled slightly as he adjusted the controls of the horizon. Despite all the preparation, the first signs of the Devourer's approach still sent a ripple of panic through him. It wasn't just the size of the enemy fleet or the speed at which they moved. No, it was something deeper. Something he had seen countless times before, the inevitability of conflict, the way people and species alike were bound by a tragic cycle of violence. War was in their blood, even the aliens. Sanchez was pacing behind him, her eyes never leaving the tactical display. "They're not even bothering to hide their approach," she muttered, more to herself than to Carter. "If I were them, I'd want to at least give the impression that I'm coming with good intentions." Carter didn't reply immediately. He knew the truth. These machines, these devourers, weren't here to negotiate. They weren't here to talk. They were here to consume, to destroy. Everything they touched was left in ruin, stripped bare, annihilated. Humanity was on the menu now, but Carter wasn't ready to accept that. "General Chen's got the asteroid belt ready for the first phase," Sanchez continued, her voice slightly more upbeat now that they had a plan in motion. "It's not much, but it'll slow them down." Carter could only nod, feeling a pang of guilt for relying on something so primitive, so human. A field of rocks and debris. But it was all they had, and if they were going to survive, they had to make it work. The thought gnawed at him. Was this all humanity could do in the face of true destruction? Make a wall of rocks and hope for the best? Good. "Let's make sure it counts," Carter said, the words colder than he intended. It was the only comfort he could give himself, as well as Sanchez. They both knew the risks. The asteroid belt wouldn't stop the Devourers for long. It was just a delay tactic. 3 days later, the Devourers arrived. The first of their ships appeared on the edge of the solar system, enormous, black, and utterly relentless. The visual was enough to make Carter's stomach churn. Monstrous ships with razor-sharp edges, resembling some kind of insect, made of nothing but darkness. They weren't just machines, they were an army of horrors, a swarm of mindless destruction. As the first wave of Devourer ships reached the asteroid belt, Carter's heart skipped a beat. The belt was a mess of rock and ice, hastily turned into a weapon. The asteroid engines kicked in, pushing the jagged mass of space debris into a slow, unpredictable motion. The plan was working, at first. "We're getting a response," Sanchez shouted from her console, her fingers flying over the keys. The screens flared to life, showing the Devourer ships struggling to maneuver through the asteroid field. For a brief moment, Carter allowed himself to feel something like hope. If they could just slow the enemy down long enough, maybe the human fleet, reinforced by the alien technology they borrowed, could turn the tide. But the hope was fleeting. The enemy adapted too quickly, their ships shifting and recalculating in real time. They moved with a terrifying efficiency, like a predator sizing up its prey. The rocks that had once been obstacles now became nothing more than obstacles to be avoided or destroyed. Sanchez slammed her fist against the console. "Damn it! They've got us figured out. We need phase 2, now." Carter's face hardened. "Get me General Chen. Now." By the time the second phase of the plan was activated, the human fleet was already on the back foot. The Devourers had pushed through the asteroid belt, tearing through the remaining debris with ease. General Chen's second line of defense, hidden platforms around Europa, was humanity's last hope. If they could disrupt the enemy's strategy, maybe they could buy more time. But time was running out. "We're not going to stop them," Carter muttered to himself, staring at the screen as the enemy fleet closed in on Mars. The human forces had already taken significant damage. It was only a matter of time before the Devourers tore through them entirely. The plan was no longer about winning, it was about surviving long enough to fight back again. Sanchez's voice broke through his thoughts. "We're still not running, are we?" "No," Carter answered without hesitation. "We'll fight until we can't." The words tasted like acid in his mouth. Was he lying to himself? Was he so desperate for some semblance of control that he could no longer tell the difference between bravery and stupidity? The whole galaxy was watching, waiting for humanity to make its choice, run or fight. Carter's heart told him that fighting was the only option. But his mind, his weary, battle-scarred mind, was telling him that maybe running was the smarter choice. The final, desperate push was underway. The asteroid fields had failed. The platforms around Mars had been neutralized. And now, in the heart of the solar system, humanity's remaining ships gathered for the last stand. General Chen had given the order to engage in close combat, hoping to use the Devourer's confusion against them. The plan was reckless, audacious, and wholly human. "We can't lose, Carter," Sanchez said, her voice laced with a bitter kind of humor. "Because if we lose, we'll never hear the end of it from the aliens." Carter managed a tight smile. "You're right. Imagine all those refugees who ran. All that were too weak to fight nonsense. Let's see them say that when we win." For the first time in days, Carter felt a flicker of something other than dread, sarcasm. It was dark, like the kind of humor you get when you're in way over your head, but it was something. Something to cling to when everything else seemed impossible. But deep inside, Carter knew the truth. Winning, losing, surviving, none of it mattered. They were facing extinction. This war was never about victory. It was about proving that humanity could still stand when everything else fell. And if they were going to die, they would die with dignity. As the final battle raged, Carter found himself standing on the bridge, watching his crew struggle against impossible odds. Despite everything, despite the overwhelming terror of the Devourers, he couldn't help but feel a strange sense of pride. Then, in the middle of the battle, just as the last hope was dying, Sanchez turned to him with a wry grin. "So, Commander, ready to admit we were all just a bunch of idiots for thinking we could win?" Carter chuckled, his voice hoarse with exhaustion. "At this point, I'd say we're idiots who just didn't realize we'd run out of luck. Guess we'll have to start counting on skill instead, Sanchez replied, leaning back in her chair, ready for whatever came next. And as the battle raged on, Carter thought, well, at least we're going down with a sense of humor. Because, after all, if you didn't laugh at the absurdity of it all, you might just cry. The battle had turned into a nightmare of light and sound. On the bridge of the horizon, Commander Carter's eyes flicked across the chaotic screens in front of him. His hands gripped the console, knuckles white. The enemy fleet, vast, unrelenting, and merciless, was closing in. The asteroid minefield that had slowed them down was now just a distant memory. The Devourers were adapting at an alarming rate. Human strategies were useless against an enemy that was designed to outthink, outfight, and outlast. Phase 3, now! General Chen's voice crackled through his earpiece, but even she, with all her confidence, sounded strained. There was no victory in sight. Carter didn't need to be told twice. The final line of defense, the last gambit, was already in motion. It had to work, it had to. The ships of the United Earth Fleet had already scattered across the vast expanse of the solar system, luring the Devourers into a trap. It was humanity's final hope, a desperate attempt to outmaneuver an enemy that had never known defeat. But Carter couldn't shake the feeling that they were dancing on the edge of oblivion. The Devourers were everywhere. Their ships, massive and unyielding, bore down on Mars, where the hidden weapons were ready. The asteroid engines had failed. The platforms around Jupiter were just barely functional. It wasn't enough. A sudden explosion rocked the ship, and Carter was thrown forward, barely catching himself against the console. His ears rang, and for a moment, everything went silent except for the dull throb in his head. Sanchez's voice pierced the fog. "We've got incoming, Commander." Direct hit from the Devourers. Carter barely processed the words. His mind flashed back to the countless battles he'd fought, the countless lives he had lost. The faces of the fallen, friends, comrades, flashed before him, their eyes always questioning. Had it been worth it? Would it be worth it this time? "You okay?" Sanchez asked, snapping him back to the present. "Yeah. Fine," he muttered, though he wasn't. He hadn't been fine for years. Not since that first engagement when he'd realized that war wasn't about victory. War was about loss. War was about watching people die, knowing they didn't have to, knowing there was always another way. But in the face of this, he didn't have the luxury of choosing another path. The Devourers were relentless. Their ships seemed to multiply, blackened husks drifting through space with frightening precision. "We're being overrun," Sanchez shouted. She was scanning the radar, her face hardening. "They're adapting too quickly. The quantum disruptor isn't working." Carter clenched his jaw, frustration bubbling up. "Then we do what we do best." His voice was cold, the same tone he used when addressing soldiers heading into a firefight they knew they wouldn't survive. The difference was, this time, he didn't have the confidence he usually wore like armor. "Evacuation protocol is still in effect, right?" Sanchez's voice was sharp, but there was no sarcasm. There was no time for sarcasm. "Not anymore." "No one's leaving," Carter replied, his words a bitter truth. "We either win here, or we don't. Simple as that." Sanchez gave him a sharp look, as if weighing his words for any sign of doubt. There was none. For better or worse, they were in it together, all of them. Humanity had never been the strongest species in the galaxy, but Carter was starting to believe they had something no one else had, the stupidity to think they could win. The fleet maneuvered into position, readying itself for the final phase. The plan was simple, if not insane. They would fire everything they had left, hoping to disrupt the Devourers just long enough for the human ships to land a critical blow. A risky gambit, but if they didn't take it, what would they be left with? Running? Hiding? That wasn't who they were anymore. Sanchez took a breath, looking at him like she was about to say something, but then hesitated. She didn't need to say it. It was written on her face, the same exhaustion that had long since settled in Carter's bones. They were both tired. Tired of running, tired of fighting, tired of pretending they could change the impossible. The first salvo hit the Devourer's ships with a deafening explosion. Bright flashes illuminated the void as the human fleet launched their last remaining weapons. Carter held his breath, his eyes trained on the screen. The Devourers staggered, their fleet briefly losing cohesion as they were caught off guard. It worked, but only for a moment. They're regrouping, Sanchez hissed. Damn it, they're adapting again. Of course, they are, Carter muttered under his breath, stepping back from the console. They don't know how to quit. Why should we? The enemy fleet split apart, and the battle raged on with an intensity that defied reason. There was no strategy left. No clever tactic to pull out of thin air. This wasn't about military genius. This was about survival. The Devourers were getting closer, their fleet coiling around Mars like an inevitability. Carter was getting used to the helpless feeling that came with fighting an opponent that couldn't be beaten. The whole damn galaxy was watching, probably thinking, how long will humanity last this time? The minutes stretched into what felt like hours, and the horizon was all but crippled. Its systems flickered, its hull groaning under the pressure. The lights dimmed, casting an eerie glow over the bridge. The enemy was close, too close. Carter's chest tightened as he watched the final line of defense fall apart in front of him. He wasn't sure what drove him anymore. The desperation? The sheer will to prove something? To himself? To the universe? He couldn't say. All he knew was that he couldn't let the Devourers win, not like this. Phase 4 is a bust, Sanchez said bitterly, tapping a console in frustration. We're out of options. Carter exhaled slowly, his eyes narrowing as he stared out at the approaching fleet. Then we'll have to make new options. The last of the human ships maneuvered into position, and Carter made the final, grim decision. Deploy everything we've got. Even if it kills us. Sanchez raised an eyebrow. You're not planning to fight them off with words, are you? Carter gave her a crooked grin. We're out of words, Captain. We're just left with action now. And in that final, desperate push, as the human fleet did everything they could to stop the oncoming devastation, Carter thought, maybe this was the stupidest thing we've ever done. But then again, who said we were ever any good at quitting? The battle outside the solar system was chaos incarnate. Carter stood in the command center of the horizon, staring at the swirling display of ship movements and the ever-increasing number of red blips marking the advancing Devourer fleet. His mind raced, but there was no room for panic, not yet. It had been a long time since he'd been in a battle where winning wasn't a certainty, but this felt different. This wasn't just another scrap over territory. This wasn't just about victory or defeat, it was about survival. He could feel the weight of history pressing down on him. The human race had been here before, countless times, fighting wars they didn't start, losing lives they didn't deserve to lose. He'd seen it in the faces of the soldiers who fought beside him in the trenches of Earth's many wars. The tired eyes, the haunted looks, soldiers who knew war was a dirty game but played it anyway, because there was no other choice. A voice crackled over his comms, cutting through the thick silence of the command center. Commander Carter, the asteroid belt defenses are activated. But they're already adapting. They're not even slowing down. It was Sanchez's voice, calm but tinged with frustration. Carter turned from the tactical display and fixed his gaze on her. He knew the truth in her words. The Devourers, those monstrous, unstoppable machines, had been built for one purpose, destruction. They weren't here to negotiate or talk. They didn't care about peace or diplomacy. The moment they arrived, it was clear humanity was a mere obstacle in their path. And now, with every attempt to slow them down, Carter could see it. The machine gods were learning faster than they could adapt. Set the next phase in motion, Carter ordered, his voice devoid of any real hope. Let's see how they handle a few surprises. As Sanchez passed the orders to the rest of the crew, Carter couldn't help but think about the irony. Humanity, a species that had spent centuries fighting petty wars, quarreling over borders, resources, and ideologies, was now faced with an enemy that didn't care about any of it. The Devourers didn't need oil, land, or slaves. They simply destroyed, consumed, and moved on. It was the purest form of war, no strategy, no diplomacy. Just annihilation. He thought about the men and women he had lost in his past wars, the faces of those who had died for causes that, in hindsight, seemed meaningless. They had fought because they were told to. And as much as Carter hated to admit it, they had died because they were expendable in the grand machine of war. But this was different. The Devourers didn't care about your background, your nationality, or your alliances. They didn't even see you as human. They saw you as food. Sanchez's voice snapped him out of his grim thoughts. Commander, we're being flanked by multiple strike forces. They've adapted to the asteroid field faster than we predicted. They're cutting through it like it's nothing. Of course they were. Carter clenched his fists, his body tensing. How could we ever expect to beat them? Humans had always been so quick to think they could outsmart the universe, as if the rest of the galaxy had the same moral compass, the same ideals about fairness. The truth was, every war fought on Earth had always been about survival for the few, at the expense of the many. What's our status on the new defenses? Carter asked, his voice edged with something darker. The platforms around Mars are activated, but they're not enough, Sanchez replied. We're under heavy fire, Commander. We can't keep this up for much longer. Carter's mind raced. It wasn't supposed to go this way. He had thought, in some delusional corner of his mind, that maybe this time would be different. Maybe humanity had finally learned the value of unity. Maybe, just maybe, they could outsmart the Devourers and win. But the truth was right there in front of him. War had always been this way, relentless, brutal, unforgiving. And now it was coming for Earth with a force that they had no chance of defeating. He glanced over at Sanchez, who was still working furiously at the console. She didn't flinch. No panic. Just determination. She was the kind of person who kept fighting, no matter how many losses stacked up against them. But Carter knew. The writing was on the wall. Humanity was going to lose this fight. Not because they were weak, but because the Devourers were something they couldn't possibly understand. They were a force of nature. A mechanical storm. And humans? Humans were just ants underfoot. Carter's jaw tightened. I've seen this before, he muttered under his breath, mostly to himself. We keep fighting, keep losing, keep hoping, and in the end, we die for nothing. Sanchez turned to him, her expression softening for a fraction of a second. Is that all we are, Carter? Just machines waiting to be crushed? He looked at her, a tired smile curling on his lips. No. We're human. We're just very good at making the same mistakes. As the battle raged on, Carter felt a pang of something else, a sense of loss so profound, it felt like the very marrow in his bones had turned to ice. Not just for the men and women who were dying out there in space, not just for the Earth they were trying to protect. No, it was the loss of humanity's very essence, the hope that they could be different, that they could change, that they could finally be the species that stood for something greater than just survival. A loud, sharp explosion rattled the horizon, throwing Carter off his feet. The bridge seemed to vibrate with the intensity of the blast. He scrambled to his feet, glaring at the display. The remaining forces were scattering, trying to regroup, but it was clear this was over. We've lost, Sanchez whispered, barely audible over the din of alarms and gunfire. But Carter didn't answer her. He couldn't. He could feel the weight of it all pressing down on him, every failure, every regret, every loss that had led to this point. Then, as the final wave of Devourer ships closed in, Carter looked at Sanchez, his expression a mixture of resignation and bitterness. I guess it's true, he said with a wry smile. The human race, fighting to the bitter end, even when the bitter end is really bitter. Sanchez gave him a crooked grin, despite everything. Well, at least we'll go down with style. Carter couldn't help but chuckle. Oh yeah, we'll definitely have style. The whole galaxy will remember humanity's last stand as the most ridiculous display of stubbornness in history. Carter's grip tightened on the console as the Devourer fleet closed in. The sight was almost surreal, a wall of black ships, sharp and angular, cutting through the empty void with a speed that seemed impossible. They were here. The inevitable had arrived, and no amount of strategy or preparation was going to change that. He had seen enough to know when the end was near. The horizon, humanity's last hope, was now a flickering beacon in the night, a speck of defiance in the face of annihilation. Status, he barked, his voice hoarse but steady. Shields holding at 22%, Commander. Weapons online, but they're adapting, Sanchez reported, her fingers flying across the controls. They're moving too fast. We can't get a lock on them. Of course they are, Carter muttered under his breath. They had expected this, but it didn't make it any easier to swallow. The Devourers, machines, vast and unstoppable, had obliterated countless civilizations across the galaxy, and now Earth was their next target. It wasn't just a war anymore. It was survival. The only problem was that the odds of surviving a war against an enemy that didn't even see you as anything more than a resource were next to none. He thought back to the countless battles of the past, the ones he had fought for politics, for borders, for power. He had seen men die for causes that were ultimately meaningless, battles that only served to create more victims. War was never about justice or freedom. It was about dominance, control, and the hunger for more. Humanity had always been caught in that cycle, fighting not because they had to, but because they couldn't imagine a world without conflict. And now, faced with a truly existential threat, they had to make a choice. Sanchez's voice pulled him back from his thoughts. They're in range. Weapons systems firing. A deafening barrage erupted from the horizon, the ship's cannons unloading into the swarm of Devourer ships. For a split second, Carter allowed himself to feel a spark of hope. Maybe they had a chance. But then he saw it, the Devourers were unaffected. Their ships barely flinched, their sleek, metallic bodies absorbing the barrage with ease. Report! Carter demanded, watching in horror as the enemy ships continued their advance without slowing. Shields dropping, Sanchez said, her voice strained. We're not making a dent. It was a cold, hard truth. The Devourers were a force of nature, not a military power. They didn't need tactics or strategy. They had nothing to prove. They simply destroyed. They wiped the slate clean and moved on. Carter slammed his fist against the console. Damn it, we can't just lose like this. Sanchez turned to him, her face ashen. What choice do we have, Commander? We've already fought back harder than any species ever has. They're too powerful. I know, Carter muttered, his mind racing. But if we go down fighting. We go down with pride. I'm not running. Sanchez opened her mouth to respond, but the words died on her lips. They both knew the truth. Running wasn't an option. The only thing left to do was fight until they couldn't anymore. And as much as Carter hated the thought, he also understood that the outcome had never really been in their hands. They were just pawns, caught in a game that had already been decided long before they even knew it had started. The horizon rocked violently as another barrage of enemy fire struck the ship. Alarms blared as the bridge trembled under the pressure. Carter's vision blurred with rage and frustration. How had humanity, with all their technology, their pride, their ambition, come to this? What had they fought for all these years? What had it all meant if they couldn't even survive against an enemy that was nothing more than a machine? He looked at Sanchez, her face pale but resolute. They had lost so much already. So many lives. So many families. And yet, here they were, still fighting. Still defiant. It's the same story, isn't it? Carter muttered bitterly, almost to himself. We fight, we die, and it all means nothing. Sanchez's eyes met his. Maybe it means something to us, Carter. Maybe that's all that matters. Her words hit harder than he expected. What was it about the human spirit, the will to fight, that made them continue even when the end was in sight? Carter had never understood it, not fully. He had always been the soldier, the one who did his job and followed orders. But standing here, facing the end, he realized that maybe, just maybe, it wasn't about winning. It was about not giving up, about proving that even in the face of impossible odds, humanity could stand tall. All ships, prepare for Phase 4, General Chen's voice rang through the comms, sharp and commanding. It's our last chance. Engage all remaining weapons. Carter nodded, his eyes fixed on the screen as he watched the final moments of humanity's struggle play out. The fleet scattered, the last remnants of hope flickering as they engaged the Devourers in a final, reckless push. It wasn't much, but it was all they had left. For a brief moment, as the chaos erupted around him, Carter found himself thinking about the wars he'd fought in the past, those wars that had seemed so important at the time. What had they achieved? Nothing. The same cycle over and over again, until it felt like the universe was mocking them. And now, as the last battle unfolded before him, he realized something. He realized that the only thing truly worth fighting for wasn't the cause or the victory, it was the fight itself. The struggle, the resistance against the inevitable. As the horizon fired its final salvo, Carter couldn't help but let out a dry chuckle. Well, he said, watching the destruction unfold before them, at least we can say we went out in style. Sanchez shot him a sidelong glance, her lips curling into a grim smile. Yeah, a really bad style. As humanity stands on the brink of extinction, every decision becomes a matter of life and death. Will they rise above the odds, or will this be the final chapter in the human story? To find out what happens next, make sure you like, comment, and subscribe to HFY Sci-Fi Love and War Story. What would you do if the Devourers came for Earth? Let me know your thoughts, and stay tuned for more mind-blowing sci-fi stories. The galaxy's waiting, and so are we.